Have you ever stopped to consider that nagging feeling, that little voice inside, or maybe, the big events unfolding around us that suggest humanity isn't always steering its ship in the best direction? It's a question as old as time, really, and it's the fascinating puzzle we're diving deep into today.
Yeah, it really is.
We've got a rich stack of sources with us, primarily from the Sabbath School Lesson 5, The Nations, Part 2, for April 26th through May 2nd, 2025. Think of it as a guided tour through some powerful insights from Genesis, Daniel, Isaiah, Romans, Revelation, and the writings of Ellen G. White.
And what's really compelling here, I think, is tracing the cause and effect, looking at what happens throughout history, according to these sources, when humanity decides, to go its own way versus following what they believe to be a divine plan.
Right.
It's about unpacking the historical patterns and the prophetic viewpoints on self-governance.
Exactly. For you, our listener, imagine we're kind of handing you a cheat sheet to understanding some really profound ideas without getting totally lost in the footnotes.
Yeah, a shortcut.
We're pulling out the essential insights, those aha moments that hopefully illuminate the bigger picture of history as these texts present it. Our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward: to understand the consequences that arise when humanity chooses to rule itself, as seen through the lens of scripture and prophecy.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it, starting way back in the very first classroom, the Garden of Eden.
Yes. The lesson beautifully frames Eden as God's original learning environment. It wasn't just, a pretty place. It was designed for continuous growth and discovery for Adam and Eve.
Like a university.
Sort of. Think of them as students in the ultimate university, constantly learning from the intricate details of creation, and in doing so, understanding more about their creator. Ellen G. White describes them receiving instruction directly from the all-wise creator with the natural world itself. The wondrous works of him which is perfect in knowledge, serving as their main textbook.
And within this incredible learning space came the very first instruction, the foundational rule laid down in Genesis 2. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, at first glance, this can seem a bit puzzling, right? We usually think knowledge is good, empowering. So why would this specific knowledge be off limits?
That's a really insightful question, and it gets right to the core of the issue. The lesson suggests that God, in his, infinite wisdom, intended for humanity to learn and grow within a framework of trust and direct guidance.
Okay.
This particular knowledge, the experience of defining good and evil independently, the knowledge of self-rule apart from God, was intentionally withheld because of the suffering it would inevitably bring. Imagine a child wanting to touch a hot stove. A loving parent would say no, not to restrict their learning, but, to protect them from pain.
That's a powerful analogy, and it connects directly to a recurring theme we see later with the nation of Israel, doesn't it?
It really does.
Their demand for a king, which we talked about last time, was fundamentally a rejection of God's direct leadership. The lesson highlights that this wasn't just a passing fancy. It set in motion a chain of consequences that would stretch far into their future.
Absolutely. As the subsequent kings of Israel increasingly disregarded God's commands, or the mitzvot, the commandments, God, in a sense, allowed them to fully experience the implications of their choice for human government.
They got what they asked for.
Pretty much. They got mortal rulers with all the inherent flaws and biases that come with being human, governing other humans. And as the lesson points out, history shows us that this, it rarely leads to lasting peace and righteousness.
And this historical backdrop, it sets the stage perfectly for the book of Daniel. The lesson explains that Daniel's sweeping visions of empires serve a dual purpose. They act as a judgment on the Gentile nations, and just as importantly, as a stark commentary on Israel's own repeated failures to live according to God's instructions.
And what's fascinating to consider is the direct consequence highlighted. Instead of the freedom and direct access to God they had in Eden, they faced centuries of being under the thumb of other nations, enduring captivity, oppression.
Wow.
This new, harsher reality became a very different kind of learning experience, one where those who were open to it could truly understand the profound difference between the kingdoms of this world, built on human power and ambition, and the kingdom of God, based on righteousness and love.
It really makes you pause and think about our own time, doesn't it? What kinds of knowledge might we be pursuing today that, in the long run, could actually lead us further away from what truly matters?
That's a good question.
It's not about advocating ignorance, obviously, but perhaps recognizing that some avenues of inquiry can distract us from more essential truths. The lesson even draws on Ellen G. White's insights, suggesting that Satan continues to tempt people to seek out forbidden knowledge while they neglect the vital truths necessary for their spiritual well-being.
And it's crucial to understand, as the lesson and Ellen White point out, that the temptation in Eden wasn't simply about satisfying a physical craving for a piece of fruit.
Right, it was deeper.
Much deeper. At its core, it was about a desire for self-exaltation, a seed of distrust in God's wisdom and authority. This echoes Lucifer's own rebellion, his desire to elevate himself, even though his very existence was a gift from God. It was about wanting to be in control, to make the rules.
Instead of trusting God's rules.
Exactly, rather than acknowledging and submitting to God's supreme authority. So the forbidden fruit wasn't just about taste. It was about the taste of self-rule.
Okay, let's pivot now from that foundational story in the garden to a later, equally significant period, the Babylonian captivity and the prophet Daniel. As the lesson points out, this era gives us incredibly valuable insights into the often complex relationship between God's people and the powerful empires that rise and fall.
Right. They'd lost their independence, so they were directly experiencing the consequences on a national scale.
Exactly. And within this context of exile, Daniel chapter 2 unfolds, presenting this breathtaking panoramic view of world history, stretching from Daniel's time all the way to, well, the end of the age.
Mm-hmm. In Daniel 2.3135, we read about King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this huge statue made of different metals. A head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and then feet made of iron mixed with clay.
And the traditional understanding, as many familiar with prophecy know, is that these metals symbolize a sequence of major world empires, starting with Babylon, the gold head, and then moving through history to a final fragmented state, the iron and clay feet.
What's particularly striking in the lesson is the contrast it draws between the optimism of the late 19th century and the much harsher realities of the 20th.
Yeah, that really stood out.
Think about the turn of the 20th century. There was this almost unwavering belief in human progress, fueled by science and technology. Many felt humanity was just inevitably getting better.
But then, bang, World War I. As the lesson reminds us, it just shattered that illusion. The 20th century, despite all its advancements, became one of the most violent periods in history. The quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that the lesson includes, "We have guided missiles and misguided men." Wow, that really captures the disconnect, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, between our tech skills and our, well, moral development.
And the symbolism of the declining value of the metals in the dream, gold to silver, silver to bronze, bronze to iron, that's also really significant, isn't it?
Very much so. The lesson connects this to a potential decline in morality and religious adherence as nations increasingly turn away from God. Ellen G. White's commentary reinforces this, suggesting a parallel deterioration in both worldly power and spiritual integrity over time, like the very foundations are eroding.
It's fascinating how this biblical perspective directly challenges those 19th century theories of inevitable human progress, like Darwinism or Marxism, which sort of suggested a continuous upward evolution.
Right, biologically or socially.
The lesson implicitly questions that optimism, especially when we look at the persistent struggles for peace, security, and real prosperity under all the different kinds of governments we've seen.
Exactly. And it brings to mind Jesus' own sobering warnings in Matthew 24 about wars, famines, earthquakes leading up to his return. While these are serious prophecies, the lesson suggests there's a certain comfort in being forewarned. It helps us frame these seemingly chaotic events within a larger divine perspective, knowing they aren't ultimately outside of God's control.
And that divine perspective is absolutely key here. The lesson emphasizes that God's hand is at work behind the scenes. It quotes Proverbs, reminding us that righteousness exalts a nation, and that a throne is established through righteousness and upheld by mercy.
Yes, and Ellen G. White, in Prophets and Kings, underscores that the true strength of nations lies in their fulfilling God's purposes. She points out that even seemingly random events are often part of a larger divine plan.
And ultimately, Daniel's vision culminates in this dramatic image of all these earthly kingdoms being utterly broken by God's everlasting kingdom, symbolized by that stone cut without human hands.
Right, Daniel 2.4445. And the lesson highlights a crucial detail. This kingdom will be established in the days of these kings, meaning not after they've all vanished, but during their existence.
So it's happening alongside them, in a way.
Signaling a simultaneous reality and the ultimate triumph of God's reign.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to Daniel chapter 7. It offers another powerful, though maybe slightly different angle on this same big story of nations and God's people. What's the main difference between the visions in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, according to the lesson?
Well, the lesson emphasizes that while Daniel 2 was given to a Gentile king, Nebuchadnezzar, providing that broad overview, Daniel 7 was given specifically to Daniel, a Hebrew prophet.
Okay.
So this vision focuses more intently on God's covenant people and their experiences within and under these world powers. It's more of an inside perspective, looking at how these global shifts impact those in covenant with God.
And instead of a static statue, Daniel sees something much more dynamic and frankly pretty unsettling, right? These terrifying beasts rising up out of the sea.
Daniel 7.1 to 3. Yes, the imagery of these formidable beasts emerging from a turbulent sea, stirred up by strong winds, it symbolizes nations arising out of periods of upheaval, conflict, social unrest.
Like churning waters.
Exactly. The lesson references Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, where similar imagery of floods, waves, churning waters is used to depict the turmoil and warfare among nations. It's a picture of instability, the often violent origins of earthly powers.
And the sea itself carries specific symbolic weight here, doesn't it? Not just literal water.
Right. According to the commentary, the sea in prophecy frequently represents the heavily populated, often turbulent regions where nations historically originated. You could call it the old country.
Okay.
And this is contrasted with the Promised Land, which for a time served as an island of peace and safety under God's direct governance, set apart amidst this sea of Gentile kingdoms and their instability.
But then there's a significant and kind of ominous shift in Daniel's vision. The lesson points out that these beasts, initially from the sea, then come up onto the land. What's the meaning of that transition?
This is pivotal. The beasts coming onto the land, into Daniel's territory, symbolizes that the conflicts and problems originating among the Gentile nations would now directly impact God's covenant people.
So their problems become Israel's problems.
Essentially, yes. The lesson suggests that because they had, in many ways, chosen to align themselves with the ways of the surrounding nations, they would now inevitably experience the consequences of those nations' actions. It marks a huge loss of autonomy and security. From the Babylonian conquest onward, God's people wouldn't really enjoy complete, lasting political independence anymore. Their fate became intertwined with the dominant world powers.
And this pattern of being subjected, being vulnerable, it continues right through the New Testament period, doesn't it? With suffering under Rome and the persecutions linked to the little horn power.
Precisely. The historical narrative presented here is one of a seemingly unending cycle of tragedy and oppression under human rulers, even those who might have started with good intentions. It starkly contrasts with the kind of just, peaceful rule God intended.
It really underscores the limits of human authority.
Absolutely. The inherent limitations and dangers of entrusting ultimate authority to fallible human beings.
And how does that powerful passage from Romans 3 fit into this, verses 10 through 19?
Romans 3 paints this very sobering, comprehensive picture of universal human sinfulness. It states so clearly, there is no one righteous, not even one.
Yeah.
The lesson specifically highlights verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. This powerfully underscores the fundamental problem. Fallen human nature inevitably leads to these cycles of conflict and injustice we see throughout history.
So it shows why we need the gospel.
Exactly. It highlights the desperate need for a solution that goes beyond human effort and addresses the core issue of sin.
And just to bring it full circle for everyone listening, the four beasts Daniel sees in chapter 7 are directly linked to the four metals in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, right? Different symbols, same sequence.
Yes, that's correct. The angel's interpretation given to Daniel confirms it. The four beasts represent four kings or kingdoms arising out of the earth. The commentary clearly links these to Babylon, the lion, Medo-Persia, the bear, Greece, the leopard, and Rome, that terrifying fourth beast.
Okay.
So both visions offer complementary perspectives on the same grand sweep of empires, using different symbols to convey God's view on their rise and fall and their impact on his people.
Now let's delve a bit deeper into that symbolic language we just mentioned, specifically land and sea in prophecy. Wednesday's lesson really explores this, and it seems crucial.
It really is. As the lesson quotes Beatrice Neal, when earth and sea are juxtaposed, earth often represents the ordered world, or even the land of Israel, while sea refers to the Gentile nations that menace it.
Like the sea threatening the land.
Exactly. Think of land as representing stability, maybe connection to God's covenant, while sea embodies the restless, often chaotic nature of nations not directly under God's rule.
So land is stability from God's governance. Sea is instability from human pride. How does this play out in Revelation chapters 12 and 13?
Well, in Revelation 12.1516, we see it vividly. The dragon, Satan, pours out water like a river symbolizing worldly governments and chaos to persecute the woman, the church.
Okay.
But then it says the earth helped the woman and swallowed up the river.
And how have Seventh-day Adventists typically understood the earth helping the woman there? What's the connection to real-world events?
The lesson mentions the widely held Adventist understanding that this refers to the migration of persecuted believers to the New World, particularly the founding principles of the United States.
Ah, the New World as the earth.
Right. If we follow the symbolism, America's emergence, with its initial commitment to religious freedom, separation of church and state, can be seen as the earth, providing refuge from the oppressive sea of the old world.
And this leads us to that intriguing image of the land beast in Revelation 13.11, which initially looks lamb-like. Given our understanding of land, what might that signify?
The lesson suggests this lamb-like appearance could symbolize the United States in its early history, founded on seemingly gentle, righteous principles like religious liberty, a place set apart, a new beginning in the land.
But not the new Israel.
No, not in a literal theological sense.
Yeah.
The two horns are often interpreted as representing key guiding principles or perhaps branches of government.
But then there's that significant concerning prophecy about this lamb-like beast eventually speaking like a dragon. What does that foretell?
It indicates a future transformation, where the United States, despite its lamb-like start, will shift and exercise power in a way that mirrors the oppressive dragon. It's understood as a future where the nation becomes a major force in religious persecution.
A huge shift.
A huge shift, a stark contrast to its founding ideals, and, according to the lesson, another consequence of choosing a path away from God's guidance.
The commentary on Revelation 12.1516 also offers some other nuances, right? Beyond just geography.
That's right. It provides a more spiritual interpretation, too, suggesting the flood can symbolize forced baptism or non-Christian practices. In this view, the earth swallowing the flood represents the unconverted within the church, those outwardly conforming but lacking real faith, being swept away by false teachings.
Interesting.
The woman crowned is seen as the 144,000 rulers, protected in their spiritual land, while the dragon persecutes the remnant, still in spiritual Babylon.
And the commentary clarifies the second beast, the one from the earth.
Exactly, because it arises from the earth, symbolizing a less turbulent origin than the sea of established warring nations. It signifies a nation formed through emigration and new principles. This aligns with the rise of the United States after the leopard-like beast, or papal Rome.
And the two horns again.
Often seen as representing key aspects of its political structure, maybe like the Democratic and Republican parties. But the prophecy warns their future dragon speech will contradict their lamb-like appearance, indicating a betrayal of those founding ideals.
Okay, let's move to Thursday's section with that intriguing title, Prophesy Again. This seems to focus on a specific movement emerging in this New World context.
Yes, the lesson sets the stage by emphasizing that the remnant church, from an Adventist perspective, arose in the New World partly because of that fight for religious liberty in the 17th and 18th centuries. The unique environment here provided fertile ground.
And Revelation chapter 10, verses 1 through 11, is seen as key to describing this emergence. With the mighty angel.
Right, that powerful imagery. An angel from heaven, clothed with a cloud, rainbow on his head, face like the sun, legs like fire pillars. The Adventist interpretation sees this angel representing a divine power, bringing the latter rain, a final outpouring of the Spirit for the ultimate spiritual harvest.
And the angel's posture, one foot on the sea, one on the land. What does that signify?
That powerful stance, the lesson explains, signifies a message that is global in scope. It covers both the old world, sea, and the new world, land, reaching all nations, peoples, languages. It's universal.
And in the angel's hand is a little book that is open. What's that generally understood to be?
It's widely identified as the Book of Daniel itself, which had been symbolically closed regarding its deeper end-time prophecies. Its being open signifies the start of the time of the end, a period of increased understanding of these crucial prophecies.
Then John is told to take the little book and eat it. A bit strange. What does that symbolic act represent and the feelings involved?
Eating the book symbolizes receiving, really absorbing, internalizing its message. The initial sweetness signifies the joy and excitement of understanding these newly opened prophecies, especially around the timing of Christ's advent and the cleansing of the sanctuary in 1844.
Okay.
But the bitterness that followed represents the deep disappointment when Christ didn't return at that specific time. It was bittersweet, profound truths, but unexpected outcomes.
So this directly links to the historical First Advent movement, their study leading to the 1844 expectation, and then the Great Disappointment.
Precisely. Their sincere study led them to that timeline, and the non-fulfillment brought disillusionment, but also the need for deeper study.
But then, amidst that disappointment, comes the command in Revelation 10:11. You must prophesy again concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. What's the significance of that?
It was a divine directive to re-examine, get a fuller understanding, and continue proclaiming the message, especially about the heavenly sanctuary, to a global audience. A mandate to persevere despite the setback and broaden the message's scope.
And Ellen G. White's commentary adds insight here too, about the angel and the book.
Yes. She identifies the mighty angel as Jesus Christ himself, emphasizing his ultimate power in the final conflict. His posture underscores the worldwide proclamation. Eating the book represents that joyful acceptance of truth about the Advent timing, even though it led to disappointment, which then spurred deeper understanding.
Okay, finally, as we start to wrap up our deep dive for today, let's touch on Friday's further thought themes and then maybe some practical takeaways for you, our listener.
Friday's material really emphasizes the temporary nature of earthly achievements, however impressive they seem. It draws a parallel between Revelation's sea beast and the spirit of Babel humanity wanting to build its own way, independent of God. And it highlights how characteristics of past empires keep showing up today.
And then there's that really important, often challenging question: how do we balance obedience to God with our duties as citizens of earthly governments?
It is indeed a delicate balancing act. We're called to be responsible citizens, respect laws, honor authorities. But our ultimate allegiance is always to God.
So when there's a conflict,
When there's a clear conflict between God's law and human law, the principle from Acts 5.29, we must obey God rather than men, takes precedence. It requires careful discernment, a deep commitment to God's word.
So, as you reflect on this deep dive today, we really encourage you to consider the implications for your own perspective on current events and your understanding of humanity's ultimate destiny as presented here. And let's bring this down to some actionable steps, some practical applications.
Yeah, things you can actually do.
First, maybe in your own life, make a conscious effort to actively seek and prioritize God's guidance over just your own understanding or the world's wisdom.
Second, try to cultivate that longer-term, eternal perspective. Remember, earthly systems are temporary.
Third, maybe take some time to critically examine the values behind the societal structures around you. How well do they align with God's kingdom values?
Fourth, if these messages resonate and bring hope, think about how you might actively engage with and share this message of God's coming kingdom.
And finally, maybe take some personal time to reflect on how you are currently balancing your allegiance to God with your responsibilities as a citizen where you live. It's an ongoing process for all of us.
Absolutely. And ultimately, the overarching message woven through all these sources is one of profound hope. Despite the turbulent history of human self-rule and the warnings of future difficulties, there's the unwavering promise of God's ultimate victory.
Yes.
The establishment of his eternal kingdom characterized by righteousness, justice, peace, where sin, suffering, death are gone. It's a future worth looking forward to and definitely worth living in light of each day.